What we're going to do this afternoon, let me see if this works better, is we're going to now focus on sort of the two of the areas that we think are critical to moving this work forward, which are indicators and response systems. If we're going to have a next generation indicator response system, we gotta do some work in both those areas. We're going to start with indicators, and we're first going to have one more short panel, basically learning from the field again. We're going to bring some folks up, three folks that have been working in the area of social emotional indicators, because we know there's a lot of interest in this domain right now, and especially when people start thinking about moving beyond high school graduation to any kind of post-secondary success, we start getting a lot of people saying, you know, how do we build our students' social emotional skills? How do we both use them to succeed, and how do we build them so they can succeed? So there's a lot of interest in this area. We also think it's a challenging area because it could quickly go down a path of like almost too much information, right? That you could almost get, you know, at some point you get information paralysis, that you have 400 data points and how do you make action upon them? So we're trying to balance where this gives us new insight, and in particular we think about at what level does this give us insight? Is this about giving us early indicators for kids, which I believe sometimes social emotional data can do, that you can pick up some stuff even before they're giving you a poor attendance or a poor course grade or they're acting out. Sometimes you can get an early indicator. So I think that's a value and an argument to be made for using some of these metrics. I think another argument could be made that sometimes there might be even better system level measures, that if our kids are not feeling welcome and connected and engaged and feeling that they can take care of themselves and that they can work well and get along with others, they don't feel that in their environment, that environment's going to push back against a lot of the other stuff we're doing. So it may be that social emotional indicators might have a particular benefit at a system level to give you that read as have we done enough looking at ourselves, as we've heard today, to create the environments our kids need to thrive and have these pathways to adult success. So that's some of the things to be thinking about as you hear our panelists. And then we're going to have Jenny from Chicago lead us into some good thinking about, again, how we should think about this question of adding indicators and how we should both, you know, sort of discipline ourselves that when we add them, we know why we're adding them, we know what more they're giving us, we know their strengths and weaknesses, and then we're also thinking collectively of when is too much and when is more better, if that makes sense. So I'd like to ask our panelists to come up and sit here from our social emotional group and our team from health indicators, which is our other things we're looking for. And we're going to ask you guys, try to keep it to about 5 to 7 minutes, the highlights, so we have time for Q&A. But we understand if you need to go a little longer, because you have a lot to share. And let me see, for those that are doing their PowerPoints, there we go. It's up. So maybe our friends from CORE want to kick us off, if that works out. Okay, great. You even got a clicker. Come on.
All right, great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Speak a little bit. My name is Charlie Hartman. I work with a nonprofit organization based in Madison, Wisconsin called Education Analytics. But I'm here on behalf of the core districts, who is one of our partners. So the core districts, a group of 8 districts in California, including our friends from Long Beach and Fresno, who are here today. And there's a larger data collaborative as well, people who use the system who are part of the districts, including Aspire, who we have some folks here from, as well as the Riverside County Office of Education. So shout out to all of our core people here. So like I said, eight districts, over 1 million students, 1,800 schools. So a lot of students, a lot of reach. So just skip through some of this stuff. So it started in 2010 as kind of in the No Child Left Behind era. So kind of getting a waiver from the old accountability system and sort of building out a new multi-measure accountability system to kind of look beyond just the traditional like percent meeting exceeding standards and to look at some other indicators, one of which is most importantly here, which my arrow is now turned into a black box, but is the social emotional. So there's a social emotional survey that. Yeah. It's a metaphor. No. So social emotional survey. So it's been administered across the 8 districts. In some instances we have identified student data, so we're able to link it up directly. In other places it's maybe just at the school and school level. So the core districts together work collaboratively. The ethos of it is there's a board of directors of the 8 districts who kind of work together to co-build all of the metrics and all of the indicators. And it was no different for deciding on which competencies to use for core. So they decided on growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. They went through and worked to build this confidential survey. In instances where we have identified data, often the districts don't have that identified data. It's like we hold it, but the districts, so like it's not like the teachers are going back and seeing what the students in their class said. This is up here. We just have kind of what we use to draw these questions from. We've done a myriad number of such things, but I just wanted to draw a couple of things where the correlations with other outcomes, including cumulative GPA, math test scores, and ELA scores, all positively correlated, but not so positively correlated that it's like, well, if the correlation is too high, what's the point of measuring it in some sense, because you already have the information. So there's some sense in which it is positively correlated, which is good to see, but it's not so much so that it's not telling a different story, telling its own story in some sense, or negatively correlated in the case of suspensions and absenteeism. I just want to call out one particularly interesting piece that we saw, which is around around self-efficacy and the difference between male and female students taking the survey. So this is not a longitudinal thing. This is just cross-sectional, right? So this is just grade by grade in a single year. But what we did do is look across years and saw similar patterns in both years. And what we're seeing is that around middle school, at a time when, interestingly, when we look at the performance on math and ELA testing, girls are actually differentiating themselves and scoring higher on tests than boys, but at the exact same time, we see that there's this story of self-efficacy actually dropping precipitously compared to their male counterparts. So it's a very interesting thing that kind of lines up to some extent with intuition and gives us sort of the impetus to say, hey, there's something here. These surveys are telling a different story. That's important. Right now, there's a larger platform of metrics that CORE has developed, including culture and climate, academic indicators, including a growth model, but right alongside all of these academic and cultural climate indicators in sort of the same platform, in the same sort of visual weight that everything else is given, we have our SEL indicators as well. So really trying to include this in the kind of reporting that supports continuous improvement throughout the core districts. One last piece, CORE is the new thing that they've launched is an improvement community based on bringing these people together, saying, hey, we've got a shared data system. We're all looking at sort of similar metrics in our districts. How can we kind of take all this information? How can we get together, see what's working for folks, and take some of these ideas back to the ranch? Take a look at implementing some responses to them, and then bring that information back. Look at ways to measure it, and then come back together as a group of these 8 districts, and start to answer some of these questions. So that's CORE and some of the work we're doing around SEL right now.
Could you go back one slide?
Sure.
And tell a little bit, because it may be difficult for people in the back to see which measures you found most meaningful and having most impact.
In terms of the SEL? I think that when we're thinking about the SEL, we have these 4 competencies, and I think that To an extent, right now, we're at a point where we don't really know which of these would be more impactful or provide more information for folks. And so all four of this sort of student social emotional skills are presented here for folks to kind of dig into and take a look at. Yeah, it's kind of a non-answer, sorry. All right, great, thank you.
Hi there. My name's Laura Davidson. I'm Director of Research and Evaluation for Washoe County School District. So my partner in crime here, Ben Hayes, had to hop on a call, but he might make a surprise appearance to add to our data story. So I'm not here to tell you a story about how we built social and emotional indicators into our early warning system, but I will tell you about kind of where we're at in that process, which I think is kind of a more interesting story in a lot of ways. So about 5 years ago, we started using an early warning system, much like probably you all are using, and we found that our early warning system was an incredible predictor of student outcomes. So ours is based on things like transiency, retention, attendance, course attainment or credit attainment, and we were noticing that when we looked at those outcomes, particularly among our 9th grade students, and we looked at their outcomes 4 years later, it was just an incredible predictor, right? So our students who are identified as no risk for poor academic outcomes in 9th grade, 90% of them graduated, whereas our students who scored a 3 or higher on our risk index, only about 30% of those students graduated. So we have been using the warning system in our data dashboards pretty extensively in our district and have all kinds of great wraparound resources for students who are identified as high risk. One of the more popular ones is some family graduation advocates who call the families of students who are high risk in high school and do sort of a needs assessment with them to figure out what wraparound supports they might need in order to make sure that they walk across our stage. But where we became really interested in the role of social and emotional competencies in our early warning system was that we do have these 30% of students who in 9th grade face incredible academic barriers and are identified as high risk, and they walk across our stage in spite of those academic obstacles 4 years later. So we really wanted to study those students to understand, are those the ones that have these social and emotional competencies that allow them to be resilient in the face of these academic obstacles, and are social and emotional skills sort of the glue that's binding them to school? Do they have better responsible decision making? Can they self-manage their homework? Can they reach out when they need help or need support in order to overcome those academic obstacles? So we were interested in that research question, and we partnered with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, in 2015 on an IES research practitioner grant to study that. So can we build social and emotional competencies into our early warning system so that we can identify not just students at risk for academic failure, but students who have the potential to overcome academic obstacles? So we started with a measure that was about 30 items. It was from the American Institutes of Research, and it's the measure that the 7 or 8 other collaborating districts who are implementing social emotional learning pretty systematically through a grant through the Novo Foundation in collaboration with CASEL are using to evaluate the impact. So we started with those student self-report items, and we noticed in the first year that it was not doing what we needed it to do as a measure. So we wanted to identify students who were at the moderate to high level of social and emotional competencies, and we had such a ceiling effect in our instrument that we weren't able to identify students with those exceptional competencies. So what turned into that research question 4 years ago to can we build this into our early warning system then became a study of the instrument itself and how students approach taking that instrument when they go into the computer lab to take it. So we started studying the ceiling effect in that instrument pretty extensively to understand why are students all saying that they have great social and emotional skills. So when we looked at the data, we found some interesting patterns of students who rated themselves as perfect on all of these items, right? And so we found that students did this for different reasons. So some students had high reading and math achievement. They were identified as no risk on our risk index. So these are students who very, very likely could have had incredible social and emotional competencies. But then we also had these students who had really low reading and math achievement, who were also saying that they had great social and emotional skills. But they were very high on our risk index. And so we thought, well, maybe some of these students are just struggling with these questions. They don't understand the terms in the questions, and so to be safe, they're just kind of saying that they're perfect on all of these. And then we had another group that it was interesting when you put the social and emotional competency items at the end of the survey, you saw that they were putting all fives and saying that they're great. And those students tended to have higher reading and math achievement, but they were more likely to be boys in high school. And so we thought maybe some of these students are disengaged by the task. And we thought that because at the end of the survey they would have that pattern, but if you put it at the beginning of the survey, they didn't. So that took us on a process where we started doing focus groups with students in each of those kind of categories to better understand what is the process of taking these social and emotional competency measures. And we learned a lot about just the impact of our survey environment and how that influences students' engagement in that task itself. And there's a great paper out right now about missing data and students. When they have missing data on a survey, that's actually a better predictor of academic achievement than their actual responses on the survey itself. So we very much found the same thing, and many of our students were saying that their proctors didn't indicate its importance or that they didn't feel like the data was confidential, so they didn't take it very seriously. And a lot of students were telling us they had never seen the results of these surveys. It's part of our annual student climate survey, along with other measures of school connectedness and that type of thing. And so that, for us, was a real aha moment that we needed to share data back with students much more frequently than they were doing. And it also made us realize a lot of things about our survey environment and how much that influences students' self-ratings on these. So that took us on a path of about 3 years of refining the instrument so that we are now at a place where we feel like we can start to analyze how social and emotional competencies might buffer against academic risk. But even with that, the original hope was to build it into our online data dashboard so that a teacher could pull up academic risk, but also social and emotional competencies and see where that student might need support. But even at this point, we're still cautious about how to share that data with teachers so it doesn't become just one more piece of data to tell a student that they're failing. So we want to be really intentional about how we share that information with teachers and with students. So I'm hoping through our conversations today and through other conversations that we have that we really understand how best to use that information so it really is an asset model and we understand all students have strengths and deficits in these areas and how we can build all students' social and emotional competencies so that they can persist in the face of academic obstacles. So we are looking at its relationship to academic and behavioral outcomes right now, and we do see a very strong relationship. And we were talking over lunch about each competency has different relationships with different outcomes. So when you're asking the question about which is the best predictor, which is the most useful, we see that, so ours is based on the CASEL 5 competencies, so self-awareness, self-management, relationship skills, responsible decision-making, and social awareness. So things like relationship skills are an outstanding predictor of suspension rates, but not a perfect predictor of academic outcomes. But self-management is a great predictor of academic achievement, and you can't have self-management without having self-awareness of your own emotions. So it's really the 5 competencies together are really telling us a lot about a student, both their strengths and the things that our teachers need to do to build their supports up. So that's our data story so far about where we are with building social and emotional competencies into our early warning system.
Great. Sorry, I have to move the mic. Thanks so much, Laura. Next up is Matt Coleman from Epic. And Matt and Epic have been doing some really great work in pushing our thinking forward around college readiness, and particularly beyond the idea of college readiness not just being about academics, but thinking about the other factors that go into college success. So,
Great. Thank you. And I'd say ditto to what they've just shared in terms of, we're not going to have any answers specific to SEL and whatnot from a measurement perspective. All right, cool. So we're with Epic, and we've been doing work for the last several years. And when we do the work that we do, if we had more time, we would ask you to go through an activity, which we call the Life Ready student. And I'm confident, because we've done this with thousands of people, including people just like you, to where you would identify the skills you took from high school that have allowed you to be successful in your career as things that fit within Castle's Big Five in terms of SEL. Without a doubt, there'd be a disproportionate, there'd be a skewed, you'd be pointing to elements of teamwork, of collaboration, self-efficacy, self-management, these things that you learn. One of the presentations this morning, somebody, I believe the man from Indiana spoke to, the role that things outside of the classroom play in the development. And a lot of the development that happens outside of the classroom is around the social emotional. What I want to talk about, so I'm not going to talk about the measurement, I'm going to kind of talk about the so what. When we think about college and career readiness, what we believe we know is that academic includes both cognitive and metacognitive, and that things like SEL fit within the metacognitive space, as does things like interest and aspiration. Yet we devalue them. I'm from the great state of Oregon. We have 9 essential skills that are required for graduation. 6 of the 9 fit more in this non-cognitive, metacognitive space, including elements of SEL. 3 are reading, writing, and math. What do you think we hold kids responsible to demonstrate to actually earn a diploma? Reading, writing, math. What do you think we hold schools accountable to in terms of what we baked into the accountability model? Just reading and math, because writing's too hard to measure validly and reliably. So just reading and math. And yet we represent the whole, I mean, just to give you a sense, if you went to the Oregon Department of Ed's website right now, you'd find 2 pages total, 2 PDF pages on the 6. You'd find thousands of pages on the 3. And the point we try to make is that when we talk about readiness, it needs to be looked at holistically, and we need to value these things equally, both the cognitive and the metacognitive. What that means in the so what, and part of the conversation where it needs to go, is that schools need to start recognizing, specifically, I'm going to pick on large comprehensive high schools, but specifically large comprehensive high schools need to recognize that there is and needs to be intentionality in terms of the metacognitive being outcomes that you actually build your instructional environment to deliver, that you actually build out your support systems to deliver for kids. That it's not something that just happens, and let me, self-regulation and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not something that happens in elementary. It's like reading. We got to keep teaching reading explicitly in high school. We got to continue to develop the social emotional skills that kids have throughout high school. That's not something that comes before. That's something we're all responsible for. So from the concept of early warning systems, just having SEL baked into them and designed into them starts to tell the system there's a value that needs to get expressed in terms of how the system organizes itself in terms of what it's delivering. And that's the work that we've been doing, trying to get people to identify. We have asked this AVID conference every year, ask people, everybody that's there is there because they believe all kids, and they believe in college and career readiness. So ask everybody believes in college and career readiness for all kids. Every hand's in the room's raised. The next question we ask is, how many of you at your school have a shared understanding of what college and career readiness is? 5%, over 3 years, thousands of educators, 5% have a shared understanding of what it is. When we're working with schools and districts that have early warning systems, the first question we will ask is, what's it built against? And no offense to ABCs, but it's built against high school graduation. High school graduation doesn't mean anything. The slide, at the very beginning, Bob stood right here. The slide that was on the screen, if you didn't see it, 5.7 million jobs lost in the recession, only 187,000 gained in the recovery for kids with a high school diploma or no diploma. That is not how it used to be. 99% on that same slide, 99% of the jobs that have been recovered since the recession, 99%, tens of millions of jobs, or just over 10 million jobs, have been for people with some college or with a degree, some post-secondary learning. So when you look at it, this idea that everybody graduates, the Everybody Graduates Center, I'll say this tongue-in-cheek, but it needs to be the Everybody Graduates Ready Center, ready for learning. Graduation is no longer the marker that it used to be. And that is something that we've got to wrap our heads around, but part of wrapping our heads around, if we're going to think holistically about kids, is that we need to be developing the whole child all the way through graduation. It's not just the cognitive, it's the metacognitive. With that, the one caution I would definitely put out there as we get on this work, and I can't believe you knew all five and you started to make the interconnections, because I can't do that. But what's important when you look at social emotional, it is very contextually driven. I was at Kanu, it's not a high school, it's a K-12, but Kanu's on the Big Island in Hawaii. And it's a school that is pedagogically, I can't even say that word, driven by Native Hawaiian culture and language. Twice the number of Native Hawaiian students at Kanu go on to post-secondary as compared to the 70% of their kids go on post-secondary, their Native Hawaiian kids go on to post-secondary, as compared to, I think, 30 to 35% for Native Hawaiian students across all of the islands. What drives them from a social emotional, if they were to build an early warning system, their social emotional indicators that they may choose to focus on would look different than Savannah High School in Anaheim, who's doing phenomenal work, whose SEL skills might look different than High Tech High Chula Vista. If you've ever been to High Tech High Chula Vista, 85% Latino, unbelievable record in terms of where they're sending kids. They would be different, and that's okay. That's okay. In fact, it's the way it should be, because context matters when we talk about developing the whole child. And it's an important piece because we keep trying to fit kids in a certain type of box, and we've got to break out of that. I could build the same argument in Oregon. My kid goes to South Eugene. South Eugene is a college town. Burns is a ranching town. Brilliant, brilliant kids in Burns. We need to be thinking contextually about what it means in terms of how and what we're looking for from a measurement system. So I'm kind of all over the place because you guys covered everything, threw me off a little bit. But it's important that when we think about it from a measurement standpoint, it's not only what, in terms of what the skills are, but then how the system will organize around providing those supports. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had a very interesting glimpse into the world of SEL, which was a big topic last year at our meeting. People really wanted to know more, and that's why we have this wonderful panel. There are also other people throughout the audience who are experts in it, and I just wanted to remind you all that everybody here is an expert in something, and that's why you were invited to share back and forth what you knew. What we're doing now is shifting into an unconventional indicator for some of us. And Delaney Gracie from New York Child's Health Fund will tell us a little bit about the perspective she takes and they take from health and what they've been doing working with their schools.
That I don't know. I think it's one more. Are we good? Okay. Yeah. So it's just.
The magic enter button, she says. Fabulous. Well, thank you guys for having me here. I'm Delaney Gracie. I'm a pediatrician, and I think I may be an outlier in this group being about health, but that is one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here. So just in case some of you haven't heard of us, we're a national nonprofit, and our mission is to bring high-quality health care to the kids living in the deepest poverty. And we do that by bringing health care to where the kids are. So we work at schools, homeless shelters, community centers, whatever we need to do for a particular community to overcome the access barriers. And with having done that, this is our 30th year. every day we see the overlap and intersection of health and education and how inextricably wound they are together, but how traditionally we work from different silos and don't cross-collaborate enough in the solutions that we design for kids. The way we actually started formalizing the work that we're doing in this space is probably about 5 years ago now. The Council for, I forget what it's actually called, but it's the Superintendents and Principals Union in New York came to us because they had seen some of our asthma work and tools and education materials online. And so they came to us because they said, we're going to call ambulances for kids for asthma all the time. You know, it's disruptive, it's dangerous, it's scary, it's a disservice to the kids. What do we do? So from that grew this initiative that we call Healthy and Ready to Learn. And it's all about how do we go upstream and identify the health barriers to learning that kids have so that those can be addressed and dealt with to clear that pathway to good learning for these kids. Because we totally agree with many of the speakers this morning that, you know, a good education and graduation is the pathway out of poverty. How many people work with underserved populations here? Okay, most of you. So you're probably familiar with these stats. But, you know, so these are the kids we're all working with, it sounds like. So, you know, 1 in 5, almost 1 in 4 kids live in poverty. And, you know, the amount for a family of 4 is like $24,000. So I don't know how far that goes in your community, but certainly not so far in New York. The other thing that we know is there's all sorts of barriers to kids getting health care. About 20% of kids don't get their regular primary care checkups and don't see a doctor regularly, and then, you know, another 20 million or so have significant barriers to getting health care. So what we did was we really dug into the literature, to the experience, talking to parents, teachers, doing surveys with teachers, parents, students, and we wanted to figure out what are the most important health barriers to learning. And we had some criteria that helped us focus. What was prevalent, what was fairly easy to identify with screening, what was treatable and manageable, and what had, you know, evidence in the literature that there was a link to learning. For us, we did target the elementary school population in this first iteration of it, and when I show them to you, you'll see that. But most of them translate across ages, and some of the work we're doing now is, you know, digging back into the 0 to 5 and also adolescents to see what changes and what else needs to be modified. But the health barriers to learning, 6, 7. So this is what we came up with. We recently released a literature review. It's about 90 pages. I don't expect you to have read it all. But there's an executive summary that's about 8 pages that really tells what we found. And it builds the evidence base for each one of these of how it impacts learning and what populations are, you know, disproportionately affected. And as you can guess, in almost everything, minority populations, families, kids living in poverty are disproportionately affected, disproportionately carry the burden of disease, of it being untreated, undiagnosed, or unmanaged, or often both. So, you know, as I said, most of them apply across the board for all ages. Lead is a particular risk factor for those under 6. I'm sure you're all aware of that. If you're not, happy to talk to you later about it. But if I had to just switch one out for the adolescent age, I'd put, you know, reproductive issues there. You know, and this may or may not be familiar to some of you, at least in concept, but this is, you know, something we talk about in public health a lot, social determinants of health. And I'm sure it's the same of social determinants of educational success for you guys as well. But what we see is, you know, kids living in poverty, they have opportunity disparities, more likely exposed to toxic stress, chronic unrelenting stress when they're children, or even before they're born. This affects the way their brains develop. And then this is part of the reason why you have the disparities in the prevalence or the impact of these health conditions. If you look in the third block, that's some of the pathways by which these health problems can impact education. You know, and again, it varies by health condition. But like, for example, for vision, you know, if you're looking at an indicator like absenteeism, You're not going to find those kids. It doesn't work that way. But if you go into any classroom in the United States and screen all the kids for vision problems, probably about 25% are going to fail. And if you go into classes in underserved areas, most of those kids, it won't be identified or won't be corrected. Or if it was identified in the year prior, they probably never got the glasses anyway. So then you're not able to receive information. Hearing is actually changing because it's increasing in prevalence in adolescents because of noise-induced damage from headphones. But something like asthma, that's one that a good indicator to see how that impacts is absenteeism. About 14 million days are missed a year for asthma. And most of those, if they're getting good medical care for that and have good access, shouldn't be nearly that high. Similarly, dental problems, about 13, 14, well, no, that's not the right number. It's 51 million hours a year are lost for dental problems. So if you're trying to improve the experience of kids in school, and we're all working for the same thing, to optimize their potential, to optimize their ability to learn and to graduate, I think it's really important to include these on things that you're considering and addressing. And there's lots of different ways to do that and how to get at them. And I think that's another conversation for another time. But we work at the school level, community level, family level, city, state, and even the national level on these issues and strategies to deal with that, including making sure whoever's trying to deal with that, especially if it's schools, have the appropriate funding to be able to do so. So I will leave you with that, but a couple of thoughts just relevant to, I think, this conversation. If you're looking at absenteeism for an indicator, often the excused absences are kind of pushed to the side. It's not necessarily a good idea because it may be one of the biggest indicator that something is going on medically that's not managed, and that is having the biggest impact on that kid. So I would encourage you to think about that. I would encourage you to think about cross-sector approaches and even ways to, I think, screening and identifying these. That's kind of one of your early warning systems, because if you don't, it will be affecting that kid and you might not have found it. I'm going to leave you with this, and that should be, I think they're giving you the slides, but this has some of the literature and work we've done in this space. So all of the stats and building those cases and the information behind each of those health barriers to learning are here, as well as a lot of information that we have and we're developing for trainings for teachers, trainings for families, outreach to kids, to help build multi-sector approaches to helping people know this, understand it, and to build systems to better deal with it. Thank you.
So we'll just have a few minutes of Q&A, because I'm sure there's some questions out there from our very informative panels. And you get in the microphone, Richard? Okay. You can stand and shout while we're waiting for the mic. Yes.
Question for the Children's Health Fund. So, stop me if you're familiar with the law regulating.
Oh, yes.
Now, I'm really impressed with what you were sharing as far as the different indicators around health and trying to make that part of the whole conversation. Can you talk a little bit about what barriers we may have to overcome to be able to make health data for an individual student available to somebody in a school?
Yes, and there's a conference I think it's in June or so, the School-Based Health Alliance. And this is mostly school-based health center people, but a lot of people also in that overlapping space of health and education. And that's one of the hottest topics every year, at least for the last 5 years. Because, in medicine, you probably know we have our own thing like that. It's called HIPAA. So it's, protection of patient information. So you have these kids, you have HIPAA and FERPA, and neither side can get the other, but it's not all relevant to the other side. So you want to protect, personal information, student information. But there's some for, what's happening with your asthma. Are you being hospitalized? What's your attendance rate and what are your grades? That's a useful link. So what we've found, just to get to the end of the story, it is complicated and it's a barrier for everybody in trying to do these integrated systems. Some of it depends on your employment and who you work for, and if you work for the school system, even though you're a health person, of what you can get access to. But most programs I know that have found ways to bridge that, it's pretty much through consent with the parents, that you just write it into the consent of what information that you're going to be sharing with those two systems and have the parent sign off on it, and that's the most reliable way to do it.
Yeah. I do know in Baltimore there's a pilot program to get pediatricians their kids' attendance data. And so there's folks that are solving that problem. Like we heard this, for most of these things, somebody's solved it. We just got to get the information out that those that need it solved. And I just want to have one follow-up on health, because I do remember in a different place you made a passionate plea for annual health screening, right, for a set of kids. Do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, about 20% of kids don't get their annual checkups. So, if you come into my clinic, we can take great care of you. If you don't come, we can't help you at all, and that's the situation for a lot of kids. But for some, the leverage point can be getting that form from your school that says, you got to get an annual physical. We did a project recently where we were looking state to state and at the state level what was required. And only 11 states plus DC have a state level required form that has specific things that are supposed to be looked at and a comprehensive physical required. Not done at the school, you do it with your community provider or whatever, but that the school is saying your child needs to have been checked for these things. None of them have all the health barriers to learning, and only DC is annual. So you might have that done, which is great, it's better than nothing, but maybe you didn't have vision problems in kindergarten, but by third grade you do, but you're a kid, you don't know that you do. So I think if schools had an annual screening requirement where they, give the form out and people do it with their primary providers, I do think it would push more people into care. And I think if the form was, specific for including these health barriers to learning, that would help some kids get screened by things that they should be, that they're not in the pediatrician's office. I think there needs to be better systems for including the parent in all of that. Most of the forms are very technical and not parent-friendly at all. But having, being more inclusive of them being part of the plan, the action plan, and then also integrating that with the school better. But that somebody was asking me at lunch, we don't want to increase the burden of kids who have access barriers before of now getting this form that their school says they have to get a checkup and they can't pay the copay or they can't get there. But I think the hope is that if you could get the screenings done on the kids who can get there, then you can focus your energies on what kind of programming do you need to do to help those kids who can't. And then, ideally it's a much more manageable subset of those kids.
Great, thank you. Other questions for our panel?
So I have a question for the panelists who spoke to the variation in cross-cultural context when it comes to social emotional learning. I wanted to know, what are some specific strategies that you know of that are used in these different contexts, especially when it comes to culturally responsive pedagogy and curriculum, and with diversity and inclusivity in the hiring of staff and teachers?
Wow. If I had a short answer to that, I don't know what I'd be doing. No, I would start with this. I think one of the things, and I'm going to pick on large systems. I was a large comprehensive high school principal. I was assistant superintendent, and what we don't focus enough on is the organizational or the cultural identity of the school. And the school's identity should be a reflection of the community in which it serves, and it often is not, right? And so the starting point for everything you just referenced, the starting point is re-engineering the school. Part of that includes the mental models, the way we think about what is readiness. What is SEL? If we believe in the cognitive and the metacognitive, what are those elements of social emotional learning that are critical but also culturally based? I mentioned Kanu. And I've had people say, well, Kanu, it's 85% Native Hawaiian. And there is this Hawaiian cultural thing, if you're from the islands, even if you're not Native Hawaiian, there's this, it's aloha, it's Hawaii. That's all true. But schools need to dig deep and need to re-engineer their own identity as an organization to reflect the students in which they serve. What happens when you do that is then you have to rethink the structures and the systems and the processes that you employ to then build and deliver an instructional program against. What we typically do is we run out and we pull off the culturally competent professional development, and we dust off this practice and that practice, and we put them on top of a system that was designed for the most part by white men, white wealthy men, to serve white wealthy men way back when, this dominant culture. And so I'm not going to sit here and say there's an easy way to do it. We have to dig deep and kind of re-engineer and remake the identity. When you do that, and if you do that well, sustaining that becomes a function of the systems. The systems actually start, you know, if you build system structures and supports around the cultural identity that's going to serve your community well as a school, those systems actually start to reinforce themselves, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks. Another question?
Very much building on that last point, and actually probably the last three presentations, one of the questions or the things that I carried into this whole 2 days with me, wondering about and how it's being engaged by other districts and other organizations, is the idea of when you think about re-engineering and you think about how you're looking at the social emotional learning, for us in DC, the impact of trauma, the exposure to violence, the exposure to neglect, the exposure to several other things, but the impact of trauma is really also we're really trying to figure out how to re-engineer our approach in DC around a trauma-informed approach, and I would just love to hear from any of the panelists kind of where that's feeding into what you're doing, because it certainly touches on many of the points you guys have made.
I'm so glad you asked that, because I have it on my little list of things not to forget to mention that I forgot to mention, so thanks. Yes, trauma and adverse childhood experiences, those are, huge factors in the populations that we work with. And originally we had that pulled out as a health barrier to learning, but then we sort of reconceptualized that as it's a base that underlies all of them and impacts all of them in different ways. With our programs that we're doing in schools, in particular with 3 schools we're embedded in New York City, that's been one of the most popular courses and trainings that we've done that teachers have asked us for in terms of how to manage their classes and their kids is through trauma-informed strategies. And one of the ones that's been most successful has been trauma-informed approaches to the school cafeteria, which sounds bizarre, but in these schools it was a kind of wild, intense, not really a safe, happy place of layers of interaction of how administration would talk to cafeteria staff, how they would talk to the kids, and just this ripple effect. But they were really responsive to some training on trauma-informed practices, and now it's a totally different environment in there. So I think that is critical and fundamental and central to all of it.
Great, thank you.
Which I think brings about the conversation around school climate, and how does that intersect and interact with the next generation of indicators? How do they interface with social and emotional learning, and where is that learning actually taking place? And when we begin to think about the conversation we had earlier about student engagement, how then what type of environment is it that we're putting forth that the students are expected to engage in, and what are those key indicators from that school climate that needs to be put in place universally for those students in general, and then what does it look like for those students that need to go beyond that for more, which I can't just kind of pushes us in their intervention systems, but in terms of looking at that next generation of indicators, I think that school climate and those dimensions of school climate has to be on that agenda, because you're looking at the whole issue of safety, and which pulls into trauma. And it's not only the trauma that's outside of the school, but it's also that trauma and those negative experiences that happen to students within the school, which actually serves as a push effect that kicks them out of school.
So you've perfectly anticipated the next part of our discussion. So I'm going to ask for one more question, and then we're going to have Jenny come up and address some of those exact points. Last question for our panel, right here.
Hi, it's actually more of a wondering than a question. I was thinking back to Angela Roman's talk about the system, school, and student level, and in Nashville, we've got a big grant through NIJ to look at neighborhood impacts, both negative and positive, on school experience and vice versa. So, you know, if you took your underlying adversities, you know, it would be looking at that from health and neighborhood, but also where are areas of resilience. So, I mean, if we're thinking about indicators, I mean, do we want to go to the school level indicators and the system level indicators to make public what we're trying to do in Nashville, to make public what some of our schools are trying to deal with?
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's just a wondering of whether our indicators are really going to be only for students,
Right.
or whether we're going to go up.
Right. And that's very much the heart of the work we're going to do in a minute, is that indicators at what levels. And I like your point, that you made many points, but the one was that it helps make public the challenges the school is facing. Because when we do a lot of our work in like mapping where the highest needs schools are, you essentially see they're in areas of high poverty. When you map areas of high poverty at a national level, you basically see islands of need surrounded by seas of better off. And that actually works against us having any kind of sustained support for those islands of need, because there's many places physically right around them. It doesn't have that same experience at all, which leads too easily, because we're all human in good and bad ways, to like, what's your problem? Like, we live in the same area. We're in the same metro Nashville area. Like, we're doing fine. Must be your fault, right? And not recognizing how micro our environments are and how they can be radically different with small spatial distance. So I think I would make a case that some of those indicators are as much for public consumption of the challenge sometimes as the school sort of knows that at some level already, right? But it's a two-way street.
Bob, could I maybe
Yep.
respond to that? I agree. I might throw a counterpoint out there. I think that we right now, we measure our schools, even with our existing kind of infrastructure we talk about, we measure our schools very narrowly. And I've got a son who's senior, who's going to graduate from South Eugene High School. If you're familiar with Eugene, Oregon, it serves pretty much the University of Oregon faculty and staff, et cetera. I was the assistant superintendent in Springfield, 5 minutes and a river away that seems like 500. It's a mill town, right? I've seen somebody who must know the area. Springfield High School, excuse my language, I'm a preacher's kid, kicks ass compared to South Eugene. But we would look and go, oh, South Eugene, wow, look at them. They're getting it all done. No, they're not. And a lot of it's in the social emotional space that we don't know how to measure. So on the climate stuff and on what you just said, as we think about the system level, we've got to think about measures of responsibility. Because if South Eugene, and I apologize for picking on South Eugene, Gustavo, the superintendent there, will be mad at me, but if South Eugene had a measure of responsibility to creating the instructional space that tended to the social emotional learning needs of kids who walked into South Eugene college bound, right, they would fail. So I love the concept of system and school level accountability, but thinking about measures of responsibility in terms of what the system has to produce. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very nice. Last thought.
Just one quick comment on that. We worry a lot with even mental health being one of our 7 health barriers to learning. I mean, it's huge and a very, very impactful one, but we do worry about stigma and labeling. And that's another thing that I think this group that we should be aware of and conscious of. You know, if you can do a map hotspot of areas with poor socio-emotional social skills, you know, the last thing we want is to have our community stigmatized in that way too. So, you know, something that we have to think about once we can measure it well is how to use that to the benefit and empowerment of the kids and the families.
Do you want to say anything? Or are you good? You good? All right. Thank you.